archivos y la idea, como os decíamos el otro día, es que a vosotros os sirvan para pensar, oye, pues yo me quiero especializar de fuera, ¿no? En el ámbito anglosajón, pues aquí tenéis al profesor, al doctor Antoniazzi, pues le podéis preguntar ahí cómo hace, después en el coloquio, pues cuáles fueron los pasos para que te pudieras ir a investigar a Leeds, hacer el doctorado allí, cómo conseguiste una beca, bueno, cosas de la vida, ¿no? De la vida. Luca Antoniazzi es doctor por la Universidad de Leeds y en actualidad es investigador, que se llama un post-doctoral researcher en la Universidad de Bologna, que es, como sabéis, la universidad más antigua del mundo, ¿no? El alma mater, como se llama. So thank you very much, Luca, for being here.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Lorenzo. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about historical background, because in order to understand the present and the future, you need to have a little bit of an understanding of what happened in the past. I will talk about a little bit about the advent of digital technology, the methods I used in my research, and then, of course, the findings, and a little bit of future research, and in particular about this capabilities approach that Loreto mentioned in the introduction. But I will start with these two quotes. I don't know whether you know these two guys, Lindgren and Henri Langlois. Ernest Lindgren was the founder of the British Film Archive, which at the time was called National Film Library. And Henri Langlois was the founder of the Cinémathèque Française. They were two very so basically these are two, heavyweight of the film heritage community since the 30s, really. But then after the Second World War, they developed a sort of a rivalry within the field, and that was, of course, their epistolary exchange has been published in 2011 in a book called The Archive Paradox, highly suggested. And so basically, these two guys were really harshly debating about the function of, national film archives, and there were two very different types. Ernest Lindgren was a bureaucrat, basically, whereas Henri Langlois was a messy sort of film passionate. And you can tell from these quotes that they were speaking two very languages. Ernest Lindgren was called the preservation guy because he was really putting a lot of stress on the preservation of film rather than access. Whereas Henri Langlois was more of an access guy, who was putting a lot of emphasis on accessibility and presentation of film. And sometimes the Lindgren versus Langlois debate is superficial, in my view. Sometimes name has the preservation versus access. So, and I selected these two quotes just to give you a sense of the kind of conversation that are, in my view, still relevant today. So you see in Ernest's quote, like the stress on assurance of permanence. Why do we need a national film archive? Why do we need to spend money on that? Well, assurance of permanence, so long-time perspective and planning of film preservation. Resources confidence with the industry. After all, film archives do not preserve films that they own, but copyrighted material. So having a good relationship with the industry, in his opinion, was a good thing. And then resources, so money, but also knowledge to bestow, technical care on films, which is quite a different task, At the time, at least in the 30s, there was no such thing as, film preservation knowledge. They didn't know how film were decaying and what were their, the reason why, the chemical reason why they were decaying, and there were no, really time and money to do research on that stuff. So very rational take, if you think, three very solid reasons and very clearly expressed. if you look instead at Unreal Black Coat, you see, you know, this very colorful language, you know. Film are like Persian rugs. You keep them out the best by using them. So show them, show them, show them. Doesn't matter whether, you know, you can damage it, you can, you know, somehow break it, or you can, you know, somehow alter the content. And then there is this sensorial, in a way, you know, relationship with cinema. You know, you learn it by touching it, by touch. Read all you like about love, but if you haven't made love, your idea will be totally false. Now, you know, the bottom line here is, you know, after the Second World War and even later on, the identity, the institutional identity of these organizations was quite vague and not really fixed, not very defined. And in fact, and this generates, you know, this debate about emphasis on access, emphasis on preservation, emphasis on outreach rather than, you know, research, etc., etc. That we will talk about more in depth later on. But this institutional uncertainty is certainly a very important feature of this field. And in fact, if you look at, well, then I wanted to underline, you know, the two key words here before going to the next slides. I cannot see the next slide, so it's a little bit difficult for me. But now I want to underline these two words: national interest and love. You know, that, you know, express, you know, this tension between this, you know, this expression. One is, you know, a really cold expression, national interest, and the other one is very warm, love for cinema. So that expresses a lot the different cultural difference and also the value articulation, let's say, behind their justification for a national archive. And we will go back to this later on. But talking about this institutional uncertainty, I define it. If we look at the history of this institution, you can see in the 30s, so a really beginning of their history, if you want. They, you know, although now we call them film archives, I use very often the expression film heritage institution. That I think it's better. But if you look at film archives, that is often, you know, the term that is used to refer to this institution. They're not stemming from the archival community. They're stemming from different you know, entities. We have film societies, so passionate film lovers that were coming together, like in Sweden, like partially in Italy, and surely in France and Belgium. You had national independent institution, like in Germany, where Goebbels understood the propagandistic potential of cinema. Another public national institution was, of course, the National Film Library in London. And then you have museum department, like in New York, and also partially then later on in Sweden, although they started as a film society, then they became part of the Museum of Technology. So this is very relevant because it means that this collection were living in different contexts with different managerial culture and different really cultural priorities, right? So, and in fact, this is, even today, this is also, you know, proved by the fact that we have so many different names to refer to this institution. There are film libraries, film archives, the museums, cinema museums, cinematheques, and so forth. So there is this you know, institutional uncertainty is still around us. Anyway, after the Second War, well, no, first let me address another point. So when I started my PhD and I started to look at this institution, I had only I realized that I only had a sort of a very superficial understanding of archives and libraries and museum and what they were actually doing. I was also thinking of them about in terms of the objects they preserve. Now, with the digitization, conversions, a book can be a digital object as well as a video can be a digital object. So this categorization that I was very superficial categorization that I had in mind was actually very, it was somehow distorting my understanding of what this institution are about. So they are. So I found this paper by Helena Robinson that really was important for me to start to conceptualize archives, museums, and libraries. And this was useful to me to understand precisely the debate I was mentioning before. Archives and libraries and museums actually do different things. It's not just about the objects they preserved, but they do establish different relationships with our past, right? It's a different way of remembering. This is because of historical reasons, but I'm not going into that. What I'm trying to do is as a very perhaps simplistic categorization that will help us to guide through to understand the consequences of the so-called digital revolution. So what archive mainly they're there to create what can be called probatory value. So they preserve objects in order to as a testimony of the past, but as historical evidence of the past. So that means that you can prove things using that object. You can basically make statements about the past using that object. And they do so by assuring authenticity, integrity, and provenance to so-called primary source. Authenticity really means that an object is what it claims to be. So if you have, original camera negative of the 40s, is authentic because the archive preserved it with a certain policy, preservation policy, documentation, and evidence, and that stuff is what it claims to be. So a camera negative of the 20s. Integrity, well, that's a bit more intuitive. Identity is about the object is preserved in its entirety, so that it's not damaged, it's not in case of film is not broken, or the film is complete. Provenance is basically the ability of the archive to provide information about the life cycle of this object. It comes from where it originated, where it was modified, and by whom. So basically, at the end of the day, what an archive do is preserving, again, historical evidence, something that you can use to make statements about the past. Where libraries do different, and so the preservation side is very important for archive, more than access, because they provide normally, historically, reactive, so-called reactive access. So you have to knock at the door, and they will provide materials, right? And it's normally, specialized audiences, researchers, historians, lawyers. Archives are more centered on access. Their function is proactive access, so they are there to disseminate content, and particularly secondary sources, so books and stuff that has been written based on primary sources, provide learning assistance. But if you look at the private libraries, at least, and in fact I'm talking about public libraries and public archives and public museums, there is a sense that the function of institution is really subjective emancipation, so that people even if you're poor or if you didn't get an education, you can go to the library and learn. Or if you don't like mainstream education, you can go to the library and read more about a subject, or read something that you don't find in schools or in other places. So there is this idea of emancipatory value at the subjective level. It doesn't mean that the archive cannot fulfill other functions. Libraries do have bias. Libraries do have, spaces where people gather together. But the primary function is self-emancipation. What I call self-emancipation. The museums instead is an institution that has been, a lot of research has been done about the ideological say component of museology and museum curatorship, because essentially museums are they provide curated experiences of the past. Therefore, in order to create social consciousness at the collective level, they create collective memories. So the values is really about the community and identity, community building, if you will. So you see that these institutions not only are different because they look different and because they preserve different things, but they are different because they create different relationships with the past. Now, film archives or film heritage institution, they do all of that because because they've taken different pathways, they've taken different directions. But every archive, every national institution, but even regional institution, they have, they feel to some extent a museum function, especially if we think like, to the classic cinema. They do fulfill a library function, not only because they do have art libraries, but also because they provide content on demand. So you can, as a subject, as a taxpayer, you can go there and watch things, DVD, online. But they are also archived because they do preserve objects, and in some cases, the value is the object itself, right? So, for instance, the National Media Museum in Bradford, in England, they preserve the technology of cinema. What they are interested in is not the content of the film; it's the actual film reel, because they collect all the formats, that have circulated in film formats that are circulated in Britain. So you find all the gouges, like 8 mil, 16 mil, 28 mils, etc., etc., etc. So of course, nitrate film, acetate film, polyester film, all sort of things. But in that case, their concern is really the object that can claim somehow they are preoccupied to assure authenticity to that object. So it's a primarily archival function. Although I'm not saying that museums do not care about authenticity, but what they do is really creating an experience of the past, and their concern is really collective. So in the film archival community, everything is melted a little bit. But anyway, there are 3 building blocks in all these organizations. And I take this from Ray Edmondson. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but anyway, we go through them quite quickly. So these are the 3 building blocks of the, if you want, the value chains of film archives, of film heritage, acquisitions, preservation, and dissemination. And these things are difficult to separate, right? Because there are huge overlaps between the two, and now you see them like clearly divided in my slide, but in practice it's a little bit more complicated. So, for instance, the documentation, I wasn't sure whether to put in acquisition or in preservation, because you do produce documentation in the moment when you acquire materials. But this documentation is updated, and that is a more of a preservation sort of activity. When another very important issue is like collection and deposit. Deposit is sort of I don't know whether you've heard familiar with the debate about legal deposits and in the digital age. But deposit is what, like, the trade union between the archive and basically the film industry. For collecting, it's a little bit a different concept, because every archive, although you have an acquisition policy, tend to also collect in other ways. Sometimes they acquire materials from I don't know, a cinema which is closing down, a film lab, post-production lab that is closing down, a private collector that deposited his stuff there. So they're a very different way of acquiring things. But then you have the preservation phase, which we can divide in conservation, which is passive preservation, keeping stuff at temperature and humidity, copying, which basically is producing a copy of the film to be preserved without intervention, without restoration, without just a copy. And then restoration, which is the activity of basically improving sound, images, and re-editing in some cases. And dissemination. I don't use the term access here. Some people use the term access, but I think the term access describes only one way of creating value. And in this category, I include, of course, internet in-house access. So you basically you go there and you ask permission to access something, or you go in one of the platforms and you watch things. But of course, theatrical screenings, DVD release, special events. But I put also low quality digitization, because low quality digitization is really something that you do to enlarge your the outreach really of the archive. And here I want to specify something in terms of language. I will use both the term digitization and the word digitalization. The English has two words, and I thought, well, that's interesting. So I can use both. In Italian, we don't have such a distinction. So with the digitization, I mean the sort of transferring information from their analog formats or the analog carrier into the digital world, into this digital format. So basically scanning. When you scan something, that's digitization. I use instead digitalization to refer to the process of sort of technological change at the institutional level, because digitization, the digital technology, as we will see, will influence every single aspect of this. All right. So when I say I'm archival digitization, I'm referring to basically creating digital content from analog collections. When I will say the process of digitalization, I will refer to broader processes of technological and institutional change. So these were the building blocks. Although the function and the identity was uncertain, as we were seeing, the difference between, archives and libraries and so on, more or less, all the institution can be are organized around these three blocks. But then something happened, and I'm telling you, it happened around the end of the 90s, when I think in Hollywood, they tested first high quality digital projector. So it was about 3K. That's the definition, And George Lucas was there, and he said, well, we here, digital is among us is possible, because the quality of the image was comparable to the 35mm prints. Comparable, not the same, but comparable, acceptable. And of course, the distributors, Hollywood distributors, were really, really happy about that, because they could have saved a lot of money, because, of course, distributing digital materials is much, much cheaper than printing film and distributing film reels. Much easier. So at the end of the night, I think it was '98, they screened for the first time. They tried this baby for the first time, and something happened there. So we went from this, although this is 16 mils, but anyway, I like the light beam, so for analog projector, this is a 3D digital projector, 4K, something like 300,000 euros. Maybe more, but at least 300,000. So quite a lot of money. Then we went from this, of course, to this. This is a film reel, and this is a DCP, standard distribution. And we went from this to this, capturing new images. That means that, but of course, the process was not that smooth. It took quite a long time, 2 years. And in the meantime, we were using this. I say as we, I was not using it, but we as a human being, we were using this. So on the right side, you have a scanner. So that allows you to go from digital to to analog to digital. And on the other side, you have a film a recorder, and allows you to go from a digital file back to film. So in this time, for quite a lot of time, this is very important for archive. For a while, these machines were very important because they were, the transition was long, and through this machine you had the possibility to, use cameras, digital cameras, and then go back to film, or use film cameras and then go back to analog, etc., etc. And these are very important especially the scanner, very important for archives, because they allow you basically to have, very high quality, DCPs made out of your collection. So most national archives now have one. Only one though, because it's half a million, investment, at least. This is half a million. And so what the point here is that, they could still keep the analog films, or they could go back to, from a digital file, they could go back to analog. But this is also very expensive. So what the point then there you have this home cinema revolution. So from DVDs to cable and fiber optic cables, so internet and VOD. But then you have also this. So film archives are, this is a tape library. This is a film digital preservation facility. And so you see LTO tapes. So digital data is preserving these tapes. And every 5-7 years, you move the content from one tape to a new tape. And you do that using this robot that you see. So it's automated stuff. It's bloody expensive. Not only to, buy this equipment, but also to keep it up, to maintain this equipment. It constantly moves. You take one cassette, put it in a different spot, and it moves content to a new cassette. Put the new cassette in a different place in the library, and so on, and then it starts again. Boo, boo, boo. So big changes for the film archiving community. And I just want to I'm going to talk a little bit about what the advent digitalization in this case, what type of academic debate it generated, and what kind of changes is generated in the archival sort of world. Let's start from academia, because this conversation about digital technology started before really this institution started to mass digitize. It started before, when digital was at the beginning, in the early stages. And I refer to this concept of this debate as digital populism in a non-derogatory term. It's not a bad thing. Now it has assumed, because of politics and because of the media, very negative, meaning populism. But it's not necessarily a word. It actually referred in the cultural sector. It started to be used in the 80s in the Anglo-Saxon cultural studies, and by cultural populism they were referring to the idea that in order to understand the role of culture in society, you should look at popular culture. You should look at the everyday consumption culture. You should look at, without prejudice. You should look at without prejudice, the culture that popular culture really, and not only focusing on the classics or so-called high culture. Now, these strands merged with digital optimism. Sometimes I refer to this as digital optimism. That's it. But I think digital populism expresses the concept in a better way. So digital optimism is the idea that digital technology can be used to challenge power structure. So the idea of digital populism is really that the spread of digital technology can challenge all archival paradigms, which I refer to conservationist paradigms, and I will come to this in a moment. And this new technological environment would have led to a more democratic access and bottom-up participation to value creation. And I'm referring to crowdsourcing, increasing interactivity with the content, labeling, reuse, remix, all this kind of stuff. Whereas the conservationist approach, I don't know, people like Paolo Cacchesai or to some extent David Francis and others, they were instead, thinking still that some people address this as the mantra of the original. This really focus on the object itself in certain cases. In fact, Paolo Cacchesai wrote a famous paper, film has an art object, and he was comparing like film reels to painting. Really. So here is the focus is really on the preservation of the original, of the archival item. Whereas these people say, well, okay, but digital technology will. Well, Paolo also argued that if it's not on film, it's not cinema. He pushed the argument to that point. These people were saying, well, no, here we have a new paradigm. We should change our mindset and start to think about, the democratic possibility that we have, basically open up the gates of the archive and allow people in. And here you have a quote, very important quote of a very important, in my view, probably the most important thinker in digital populism, what I call digital populism. And he stresses this, absent an aggressive and enthusiastic populism, the archives risk irrelevancy and increased marginalization. So he argues for so-called digital abundance. I included digital. This is not in the original text. But he was talking about digital technology right before this sentence I choose. So the idea that through digital technology you can create a different archival paradigm and more democratic, and more interactive. There is a very interesting, that at the time, for me at least, it was a very interesting thing to explore, although I was reading stuff that were putting forward criticisms to this line of thinking. Of course, they were not publications that were specifically referring to film heritage, but were referring to, digital culture, the internet, and even museum, digital museum, I remember a paper was called. And basically what they did with these people, they're, opponents, if you want. I'm not talking about a conservationist now, Paolo Kerkusainen, and I'm talking about people who were criticizing, digital populism, simply saying, look, you are very optimists. There are other things around that that makes, democratization a very difficult process. And they were talking about social class, education, gender, and other stuff, and other sort of variables that were actually influencing the access to culture. So I said, let's have a look. What is really happening in the film heritage sector? Let's have a closer look. And some preliminary research that I carried out. It is very superficial stuff. In fact, I don't, not consider them findings. It was like knowledge that I acquired going to conferences and reading some policy documents issued by FIAF or by national institutions, published stuff is that I think in red. So this is basically the same slide I showed you before. In red, I underlined the, what really, in terms of institutional architecture, what really was, for me, from my point of view, relevant. So the impact on digital migration, the LTO tape cassette that I showed you before, intuitively, they were actually quite a problem for me. So I wanted to see what these people are doing with it, these solutions. Or high quality digitization. I had experiences in film laboratories, and I knew that high quality digitization was not that easy and was not at all cheap, quite expensive. And also, I wanted to see how they were approaching the internet, what kind of solution they were putting in place to disseminate their content. So, but I came to realize that these three things, at least preservation and digitization, but also acquisition, it was impossible to separate them because acquisition, the amount of work, the material that you acquire will influence your preservation policy. Your preservation policy will definitely, influence your dissemination policies or your access policy. So I got into this concept that I think it allowed me to consider everything as a whole. And digital sustainability, I'd never used digital sustainability, I just referred to it as sustainability, which was coming from the librarianship, from I think a publication by Kevin Bradley defining digital sustainability. And I find it very interesting, but also very focused on the priorities of librarians, because it was very access centered, and basically the definition of it is basically permanent access to information. So if you want to implement a sustainable digital strategy, it means that we'll provide access to materials indefinitely. It's very true, but I thought it was a partial sort of a definition that was marginalized, added aspect that I found very important. So I decided to go into cultural economics. I have a master's in cultural economics, and I remember I read this book, The Economic and Cultural Policy, by this guy called David Crosby, who talked about the cultural sustainability, so sustainability in the cultural sector. And I come up, and then from there, and I read other stuff, and Robert Solo's also as an economist, but wrote a couple of papers, more theoretical papers, accessible also to non-economists, that really influenced me in the conceptualization of this concept, well, of sustainability. So I define sustainability as the capacity of the film heritage community to morally determine its labor processes, technical, organizational, and intellectual, to indefinitely keep value film collection widely available, and at the same time actively enrich the new cultural production to compensate for heritage losses. Now, there are three key words here. The first one is morally determined. So morality is the fact that sustainability should be conceived as a morally driven way forward, where you have conception of the good and what's desirable and what's not desirable. And I think this is very important for the public sector, because IT corporations are determining a lot of, and at the moment, a lot of the choices they are making, because they depend strongly from the IT sector, more than from the film industry, because this developing this infrastructure, it's really challenging. So they have to delegate a lot. The other key word is values, and again here I use values instead of access, because what it's important to me, it's really what people achieve through access, how these things, how these films and these experiences have an impact on their life, the values. And then the third element is heritage losses, because, and as I took this from Robert Solow, was criticizing precisely a certain version of sustainability studies, and more radical if you want. And he argues, look, guys, talking to these, what I call conservationist, and I think this debate is pretty similar to what I just addressed in the previous slide. He was saying, look, things sometimes are good and should be preserved for what they do rather than for what they are. So that means sustainability is more than halting the process of decay of objects. There is a dynamic element in it. So you can somehow intervene on the object, and to some extent losing some information, some heritage, some bits, in this case, of heritage, as long as you create new value. So that provides some flexibility, right? Especially very useful in this time of technological change, where you have compromises to make, because nobody has a limited budget. Nobody has, there's profound ethical choices to make, and giving you some space to say, okay, we can let go some stuff as long as we actively engage in new production. But this is pretty vague, right? Not vague, but it's what are implications? How can you operationalize it into research? So David Crosby helps us because he identifies four principles, intragenerational, to define sustainability. So things you should look at when you make decisions for the future: intragenerational equity, intergenerational equity, significant, and interconnectedness. We're not talking about interconnectedness tonight. Actually, we're focusing on the first three. Intragenerational equity is basically relation. In here, you have issues relating to access and democratic access, and open access, and what I call wide availability. Intergenerational access, equity. Here you have the questions of posterity, and mainly are question of preservation. Not only, but a lot of them are. Then significance. This is what I will talk about later on, because this is key. And I came to realize that it was key at the end of the PhD, so that's why I'm developing further research. So how did I approach the research methodologically before getting to the findings? At the beginning, I wanted to do quantitative research, but really I couldn't. I mean, it was very difficult to access the numbers, and it was very difficult to identify trends because everything was at the beginning, right? So my supervisors told me, why don't you go for a, quantitative research? And I did so, and I think I did the right things, because we'll see later on that numbers, there is an interpretative element also in quantitative analysis. But anyway, so triangulating elite interviews and policy document, I could come up with reasonably reliable findings. I selected, of course, there was purposive sampling, so I selected the institutions that I find more, basically those institutions that had in place digital strategies, if you want. That means that that creates some problems in terms of generalizing findings, but I think I covered quite a wide ground. And then I used thematic analysis to analyze the findings, to the data. Sorry. So thematic analysis allows you to find these big themes, and then you break them up, and basically this allows stimulates your interpretive process. And I used NVivo, which is a software that allows you to structure the data set in a pretty easy way and clear way. Here's some literature if you want. So what did I find out? Intragenerational equity, so access. I realized that some of the language of and concept, even ideas of this, what I call well, here I use digital optimism, but so digital populism / optimism. Populism is not a bad word, by the way. I've stressed this again. I don't want to, legitimize these guys, but this is what it is. Digital populism. So there's the idea that regular people should access the archive. Regular people should get involved. But these ideas were co-opted into another concept, very interesting: economic instrumentalism. So the idea that public subsidies should be provided to culture because of its economic impact. So if you read some of the stuff that are coming out from the EU, you really see this. The message is this: okay, guys, this stuff is good, it's nice. I know you like all films, but you need to prove that these has some sort of economic impact on the film industry. Otherwise, you're kind of in trouble, because if there is no demand, well, there is no value after all. It's a very sort of neoliberal, if you want, conception of what public subsidies should be about. I don't want to delegitimize this thought either, there was, in fact, a problem with the community, the film heritage community, not really dealing with access and accessibility. So that was kind of a stimulus, economic instrumentalism. So here's some money, please do something for access. But after all, I think it was counterproductive, and here's why. This, here's just 4, statements, pretty blunt statements. But by the way, when I was finishing my PhD, well, I already finished the policy. Well, research from the Audiovisual Observatory came out, perhaps my very similar questions, and I was happy to see that some of my findings were confirmed by the observatory. So this 4 points here is really my stuff, and also some stuff that is coming from from the document I cite at the bottom of the slide. So internet access is not providing, it's not really widening access to collection because of two reasons. It is widening it, in a way that is not so disruptive as people have predicted in the past. So there is some stuff up there, more than in the past. But only between 16 and 20% of the collection is digital, and only a small portion can go online. Moreover, the cost of building catalogs and building libraries and building digital strategies is quite high for regular, even for national institutions. Right? So Google can do it, Facebook can do it, Amazon can do it, but national institution, not so much. DVD, everybody would thought, oh, it's gonna go, and it's still relevant in this niche market. Why? Because you can possess the object. You can watch it again. You can watch it in 5 years, hopefully, or at least that's the impression people have. You can access to extra materials. So some of these DVD have a publication inside them. And so DVD is still relevant. Although the market is collapsing, of course, but in this still niche market is still very important. And the third point, I was much more positive in my research. I thought that there would have been a bigger distribution of film heritage work in theaters because it's simply less expensive to send them around. But according to the report, no, there's not such an impact on film theaters circulation of heritage materials. And my idea is because even other people have digitized their circulation and distribution. So there is much more content available of different kinds, not only film heritage works, of course. So you are competing with other people, and they do have strategies, commercial strategies, marketing strategies, so on and so forth. So you have competitors, basically. And fourth point, television, it is an important exploitation channel, but the impact of digital technology is almost irrelevant. It more or less is the same thing. They share the same market share. But, and that I didn't know, it didn't come up from my research, but it did come up in the research of the Observer. They're selling, archives and libraries are selling content more to smaller broadcasters, and they pay less. And this is probably because a lot of bigger broadcasters, they are buying, and this is, I don't know, but my sense is that they are buying, high-end television, quality television, so-called. So, and that's a huge competitor because a lot of people that might be interested in a classic film, might also be interested in this high-end television.
Sí, bueno.
Sherlock, or I don't know, Game of Thrones, all this stuff. So the content seems to be diverted to smaller broadcasters which do not have the money to afford Game of Thrones, and they're buying these things for cheaper prices. That's not really good news. But anyway, for archives, but still, that is okay because you still have a market share. I don't put the number, but I have. You find the numbers in this report. So here comes the problem with this digital preservation, because digital preservation, I found out that a lot of people have digital preservation strategies in place, but there are a lot of problems in terms of standardization. So these institutions are not really communicating, and this is very important in the long term. There is a second problem, which is the planned obsolescence. That means that a lot of these IT products, in particular LTO tapes, are degrading very quickly because are built to become obsolete in 5-6 years. So it's a business model from our IT industry. So, and the EU is trying to regulating that, but these big guys are very powerful. So that means a lot of money, for public institutions. But then you need to update your stuff every 6-7 years. And then the soft funding. So governments are providing extra funding, but it's normally one-off thing. So a project based that doesn't allow long-term planning. That's what you need in intergenerational equity, to plan the future. So I conclude. So this, and then a last slide. That is the core message of my thesis. Increase in preservation costs is not matched neither by increases in public subsidies, nor by extra resources generated directly or indirectly by digital access. So that is the sustainability dilemma. To do this, that means that government should intervene, right? And I think that, I jump a little bit. In order to ask for the government to intervene, what we need, and here researchers are really important, we need to come up with a better understanding of the cultural value of this collection, what they do to people, why people, should watch them, why people who are watching them actually do so, and why more people should look at them. And so my proposal that I defined in the paper Loreto was talking about is to look at this new approach that some researchers are bringing into the cultural sector, called the capabilities approach, that really look at the subjective responses of the subjects, of the individuals, and of the community, so small-scale community, to the exposure to film heritage, in order to, reach this, a better control over their emotion, more open, being able to use their sensing, enjoy a recreational moment, etc., etc., etc. I'll answer a question in the Q&A if you want, because it's a pretty complex issue. But here, and I finish with this slide, I want to underline this word, love. So we got back from where we started when we were mentioning the Henri Langlois. Henri Langlois, although he was a messy guy, he had a point, I think. And we are seeing this, in my view, we're seeing this in this sort of legitimization crisis. We should look more at the subjective engagement and emotional and experiential engagement with the heritage sector. These are the questions that one might ask. I'm skipping a little bit, but what can we achieve through the exposure of film collection? Can we reach, a better understanding of our emotion, for instance, or a better social life, for instance, through going out and, with other people with our own interests? In screening theaters, what's the role of screen theaters? What's the role of film heritage in creating sense of place? So that's a very important issue of historical rootedness to your neighbor, to your city. These are some of the possible questions that I don't have the answers to that, of course. And I'm just saying that I think these are the questions you should ask. So these are the books I'm reading now. And I'm going through them, and the first one is a purely theoretical one. These two, these are application of the capabilities approach to the internet world. Here, instead you have the music world. And I'm also going to media experiences or media engagement literature. They're mainly television people here, but they do a lot of very interesting stuff. And then this book, The Archive Effect. I just read it, and I think it offers so much to, and these are my conclusion, basically. Sustainability problems that I tried to develop before, that require government intervention, purely participatory culture, access only, or economic value articulation are unsatisfactory, in my view. We need a better understanding of the value of film collection in relation to the library, archive, museum functions that I talked about before. The capabilities approach can prove fruitful to do so.
I would like to go back to this aspect of digital sustainability, which was one of the main subjects of your presentation. Yeah. And I was wondering, I mean, you were talking about digital sustainability, and you were focusing mainly on the distribution aspect, if I'm correct, and on the way film archives relate to general film culture, or to the way film archives do present themselves within a broader context. And I was wondering what this digital transformation for the last, I don't know, 30 years, 20 years, whatever, means if we also consider not only the way we deal with material, but also the way we consider material itself. Let me put it this way. What do you have to save? In archives, as you mentioned, were born the period, the 1930s, others the 1950s, mainly in Europe, where film was a scarcity. So the question was, okay, take care of so much you can, save you can. But what are the implications of this approach if we consider the transformation in the audiovisual
world
playground for the last 30 years? So I don't know if that's really a question or just wondering without that.
Well, okay. Well, first of all, in terms of digital sustainability, perhaps I stress a little bit more on the distribution side, but because of time. But what Crosby called, and I used as the intergenerational principle, equity principle, stresses instead more preservation issues. And I was saying that I don't think it's a technological problem; it's a market problem. The fact that it's so expensive and complicated to preserve digital information for smaller institution and organization. It's more about, like, due to this digital obsolescence that means that the world is constantly changing, and this institution cannot have the resources and the time to keep up produced. But what I use, so digital preservation is for me very, very central to sustainability thing. So it's not just circulation. It helped me to focus on distribution as well, to say, look, we have costs of digital preservation going up. We don't have extra resources, not even from distribution, because the institutional context doesn't allow these institutions to make money. And that's for what you were referring to. I think it was abundance of content out there. How do we select what is produced? That's a big question, and to be honest, I don't know. If you look at the institutions, archives, it's a priority. If you look at national archives, my interviews, it came up very clearly that because of the cost of preservation, they are acquiring what they absolutely have to by law. So national productions, mainly. If you talk about digital, because that if you start collecting digital materials, you end up with a library that it's just too expensive. Whereas in the past, when they had digital analog collection, they had different sort of income streamings. There was as I said before, there was, of course, the legal deposit, the relationship with the industry, but also the private collector coming in with some films, lab closing down, coming in with some films, and that's why you rediscovered films even now from the silent era, because they haven't been cataloged, and they are somewhere sometimes. Now the income, it's much more because it's expensive, because they have to contain the old analog and the new digital, more or less the same budget. So there is a problem. It's a paradox. You say, so much content, but what they are acquiring and what it will survive probably is far less diverse than in the past. That's national archive. And I talked a lot with regional archives. Head of digital, regional archive In Britain, you have 6 or 7 very important, but also from other countries. Paradoxically, they also have problems with acquiring stuff. Why? Because people are not giving them materials. They preserve them in their hard drive or in their computers or in what's that? Amazon Glaze online. So he said, yes, he said to me, yes, preservation. A very smart guy from the it's called MACE, Media Archival Central England. This guy was working at the BFI before us. His film archiving knowledge was really, really solid. So I had really good conversation with him. So he said, yeah, preservation for us is a problem, yeah. Access, yeah, as always. What we are struggling with is acquisition. We are not acquiring digital, amateur film or independent film, or we have a lot of shorts, collection of short film, because people keep them in there. So paradoxically, what is in the archives today, in the age of digital abundance, is less diverse than in the old media paradigm. So the question of selection, it's key. I mean, and I don't know.
No, I wasn't hoping for an answer. I think it's very. It's one of the main issues right now, and I've been talking to people with it.
Navigating an ocean of information. And I think stop here because I don't have an answer or a way
That was
forward.
very interesting. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much anyway.
Thank you very much, Luca. I think we can leave it here. Thank you, Fernando Ramos and Luis Fernando, also who are on the other side of the wipes. And thank you, Jorge, and also Daniel for the help. And that's the first seminar. So, that's the beginning of this adventure of putting together scholars and also professionals, archivists, and of course students, and work together in this new German chair and together with this master. So thank you very much. And,
thanks a lot to all. It was a pleasure and an honor to be invited and to be the first one.
All right, thank you. I think an applause for Dr. Luca.
Thank you very much.